Howdy, folks. Today we're diving deep into photography education, mentorship, workshops, and exploring what the future holds for photographers looking to master their craft. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts. And before we get started, I've got one thing to ask of you. Over 65%, as it turns out, of our viewers on YouTube and listeners on audio are not actually subscribed to this channel. Come on, folks, let's change that. Just hit that subscribe button. It helps me get even more cool guests on the show. It's just one click. That's all it takes. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, let's welcome today's special guest, world-renowned photographer, educator, and Adobe Lightroom expert, master of photography workflows, documentary storyteller, and all-around incredible teacher. Give it up for none other than Jared Platt. Jared, man, how's it going?
Good. It's a good day.
Fantastic. It's so good to see you on the show. We briefly ran into each other at Imaging over in Dallas. It was good to meet you there.
Yeah, that was a fun surprise. It's always interesting to go to conferences because you not only meet new people, but you see people. There are people. So I met you through Mark, and I see him. He lives right down the road, and I see him at conferences only. Like we very rarely see each other in town, but when we're at conferences, we see each other all over the place. So it's interesting. There's like 3 or 4 people that live in my city, and I see them only when I go to conferences. So that's our place to catch up.
It's difficult to track Mark down as well because you never know where he is in his Land Rover.
Yeah, he's a little different because he's a world traveler. I always imagine that I could do that, kind of in my dreamy brain. I think, oh, that'd be fun to travel the world and not have a home and go from place to place and be nomadic. But I don't think I would enjoy it as much as I believe I would when I'm hallucinating.
I always think I've enjoyed for like 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. I could probably stick out. But
Yeah, I could do it for a couple months probably and really have a blast. But then I would probably want to get home and put my stuff in a space. And
well, that's it. Also, I always like to try new things, and there's this sort of gear acquisition syndrome that I suffer from, once in a while. And I don't know. I find it very difficult to travel light. So this is actually, in fact, that's a running joke in my family because I never travel light. This is just an impossibility. I always take way too much stuff with me because I always think I need it somehow.
yeah, there's the what ifs. So what if this happens or what if that happens? How am I going to handle it? I might need this extra light or I might need an extra camera. And I mean, there are certain things that I don't think that you can travel without. Like you can't go somewhere remote and not have a second body, like a second camera body. Because otherwise, if one goes down and you're being paid to be a photographer, you're in trouble. In fact, I remember when I was 20, I want to say I was 22, no, about 22 years old. I was traveling as college students do. And I had a backpack and I had my camera and I went out to London because my brother was studying there. So I slept on his floor at the London School of Economics for like a week. And I would go out and do like little day trips taking pictures. And then when he got done with his semester, we went down to Florence and down to France. And like, we were just traveling around. And my camera gear got stolen in Florence. So it was, we got to the train station and we had all of our bags, and like an idiot, I trusted my friends and my brother to kind of control the bags while I went over to grab cash or something. And when I got back, the only bag that had anything important in it, which was the camera bag, was gone. My brother had not paid attention to it. They had just been, talking to each other or whatever. And so somebody stole it, and I lost all the film that I had shot, all the cameras I had, like it was all gone. And so then I had to immediately go down to the nearest camera store. This is back in the film days. So it's not like I was, buying a really expensive digital camera. I was buying I think I bought an FM2, an old Nikon with a 50 millimeter lens. Went down, found this old camera at this shop, bought 10 rolls of film, and that was what I used for the rest of my travel. And at the end of the travel, I was doing some work for my thesis, and so I was meeting up with photographers from the Swedish group Tio.
Yeah.
So the subject of my thesis was a man named Hans Hammarskjöld, and I was supposed to spend like a week with him or whatever. And so that was my camera. That was what I got to use. And so anyway, I had to do some serious work with a very, very limited camera and just a 50 millimeter lens, no flashes, no nothing. I just had the bare minimum. So it's rough to just like lose something and not be able to work. So you travel a little heavier than you should if you're being paid. If you're just on vacation, then sometimes you can be like, all right, well, if something were to happen, I could always, use my phone or
So I can't remember who it was. It may have been Steve Brazel. I remember when I was talking to him in the run up to imaging, and he goes like, "Also, what kind of gear what are you going to film with and whatever." And I said, "Well, I'm going to take like a Z8 and a 24 to 70, and a gimbal and stuff like that." He goes like, "Why don't you just film it on your phone? On your iPhone?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, I guess I could, but no, I just can't." I just can't get myself to do that. Do you know what I mean?
right, yeah, yeah. No, you
Eh,
want the absolute best quality, and you're like, well, that chip's too small, and so I can't get quite the depth of field issues that I want. Like, I want to have limited focus, and so you tend to talk yourself into the need for really serious gear. You know what I've learned recently, that has been liberating is I used to carry a big flash.
Yeah.
To me, the flash was the most important thing, because it's what creates this light and overcomes, the sun and things like that. So I would carry uh, a B10 plus. So it's about 500 watt seconds.
Right.
So it's a powerful enough flash to do pretty much anything I need. But that's a pretty big flash. I mean, it's not huge, but it's big enough. And so that's difficult to carry around in a backpack situation. But I always felt like I've got to have this light so that I can overcome and I can do whatever I can create whatever kind of lighting scenario I want. And then I would have like a little collapsible softbox. But I started shooting with the Sony A9 III, which has the global shutter.
Yeah.
And as a result of that global shutter, I can I can overcome the sun or any ambient light that happens to exist simply by my shutter speed because there is no sync speed anymore.
Yes.
Like sync speed doesn't exist. And so I can shoot at a thousandth of a second or an 8,000th of a second or a 30,000th of a second. And it doesn't impinge on the power of the flash. And I don't even have to be in high speed sync. And so as a result of that, it's amazing how little light you can get away with. So now I can use a little A2, which is, it's the size of a Coke can. And I can put 2, 3 of those in a camera bag along with 2 bodies and 2 lenses, and I can have all the light I want in the world because that global shutter overcomes all of the ambient light. So then I can just dial in how much ambient light do I want. If there's sun hitting someone's face, I don't have to like totally turn away and put them in the shade because all I have to do is just dial down that ambient light until the skin tone looks exactly the way I want it to look, and then add the flash and overcome whatever, you know, light pattern is on their face. So it's amazing how much just one little tweak to a camera can change the whole scenario so they don't have to carry around this really big flash. So now my lighting situation has changed completely. I've just got this little tiny flash and then, whatever modifiers.
So the global shutter thing is super interesting. Just explain for the for those listeners who maybe not necessarily that familiar with with off camera flash, for example. What is the difference between high speed sync and using a global shutter in the way that you've just explained it?
So high speed sync is an interesting, uh, and it's taken a long time for it to get to the point that's even usable. Like it's been around for a long time, but basically what happens is because of the sync speed, there's a shutter that's getting out of the way in order to expose the frame, and then it's coming back in the way, and it moves. And as a result of that, when you take a flash exposure, that shutter comes out of the way, and it might be closing at the time that the flash goes off, or it might be coming on when the flash is opening. So you might get partial frames. And interestingly enough, when I was first taking pictures, I was shooting with film, so it's not like you see what you're going to get. And I shot a wedding of some friends, and this was when I was very first into photography. I had no idea what I was doing. I was in college, I was just learning, and I shot on a Pentax K1000, which had a 1/25th of a second shutter speed, sync speed for the flash. And it has like a little lightning bolt on the setting. I didn't know what that meant. So I took some photos, and the entire set of photos were they the frame is like this, but I took it and it was square frames because the other third of the frame was dark because the flash had gone off while the shutter was closing, and so I just had this shadow on the frame on that side, and so it ruined, I don't know, 2 or 3 rolls worth of film because I didn't know that that's what I was doing. Anyway, so what happens is they decided, okay, we've got to find a way to allow people to use a higher shutter speed than just 1/25th of a second or 2/50th of a second. And so what the flash does is it tries to become a constant light. And so the flash fires a whole bunch of times. It just goes like that, just rapid fires, so that as the shutter opens and as it closes, it's getting a lot of exposures as that happens. And as a result, it pretends to be a constant light source as opposed to a one momentary light source. And that tends to fix the problem. However, when you've got a flash firing at rapid pace, bam, 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 like that, it really weakens the flash. And so, like on a pro photo flash, if you go to 10, so you want 100% power out of that flash, and you go into high speed sync, the best you're going to get is a 9, which is half the power that the 10 could have given you. And so you're weakening your flash by at least a half. Like you're cutting it in half, and probably a little bit more than that. You might even, be at a quarter the total power that flash can deliver. And so it's not ideal because you're always going to end up with a weaker flash. And so if you needed a power of 10 on that flash, you're never going to get it. So then you have to bring the flash closer in order to get more light out of it. And when you bring the flash closer, you end up with a lot more contrast on the face. And so that you have a really bright side and a really dark side. And maybe you want it to be, a softer light source, and you want it to have an umbrella, or you want some kind of a softbox. Well, now you have to take that off and you have to put a hard light source to try and get more power out of the reflector. So you end up changing the way your photo's looking just because you can't get the power out of that high speed sync situation. With the global shutter, because, well, and then So that was with the old shutter type, right? So a moving shutter created that shadow. And then when we got to the point where we were doing a flash that's no longer, because now you have a an electronic shutter. So as soon as we got into completely digital cameras where you're actually, you're looking through the chip instead of through a mirror, and there's no shutter involved, that changed the equation a little bit. But one of the problems that you have with a typical mirrorless camera, which is all of them except for one, um, you have it's scanning like this. It starts at the top left and it scans, and then it goes over to the next line of pixels and it scans and it scans and it does it very, very fast. But that scanning process takes a certain amount of time. And as a result of that, you can only uh, photograph that scan has to go like this in the entire time that the light is on. And so if your flash only stays on for X amount of time, then you'd better scan throughout the entire time that that flash is on, that X period of time. And if you don't, you're going to get a weird result. So that's a problem. And so that limits what you can do with that flash and whether or not you can, shoot at that, 8,000th of a second, or if you can shoot it, a 1200th of a second. And so as a result of that, you still have limitations on the flash. And so you're still using high-speed sync to try and synchronize that whole process together. So then enter the global shutter, which is what the A9 III does. The A9 III, with its global shutter, all of the pixels are firing at exactly the same time. And they're all turning on, then they're all turning off. So there's no shutter that has to get out of the way, and there's no scanning. So it is truly just a open up, close, open up, close. It's instant on, instant off, which means that the flash, it doesn't no matter how long that flash is operating, it doesn't matter what shutter speed you're at, you control the ambient with the shutter speed, how long those pixels are on, how quickly they go off. And then the flash comes in and adds its bit, which has nothing to do with the shutter speed whatsoever. And the only thing that controls the flash's power is the actual power that you're putting into the flash, the aperture itself, how much light is getting into the iris, and then the ISO, how sensitive is the chip. And so it's an incredibly liberating experience to finally separate out a shutter speed from all of the other exposure. Because it used to be that like you could shutter speed has never controlled flash. It's just that stupid shutter getting out of the way that was the problem. But the shutter speed itself, if you were in a completely dark room, you could have the shutter open for an hour and it wouldn't do anything. And then the flash would come in and add exposure. So that the shutter speed doesn't have anything to do with how extensive the power is on the flash. So you could completely independently control the two, except for the fact that you had this cap of 2/50th of a second or 200th of a second or whatever the sync speed was. And so the global shutter has completely removed the issue of the shutter speed itself and the sync speed. Like it's completely separated it out, and now you're completely independent. And you can control your ambient exposure and you can control your flash exposure completely separate from each other, which makes your capabilities infinite when it comes to how you want your photograph to look, especially for people like me, because I'm always photographing outdoors, bright sunlight. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. It's pretty harsh sunlight, and I need to be able to control my flash exposures and my ambient exposures completely separately. And plus, when I'm inside, I want to be able to control that too. How much window light do I really want? Do I want to see what's outside the window, or do I want it to, do I want to see a hint of what's outside that window, or do I want to see everything that's outside that window, that's all that ambient shutter speed control. And by being able to separate those two, I open up my whole world to be able to do whatever I want, as opposed to photography's always been like a trade-off. What do you want? Okay, what are you willing to give up to get that? And this just kind of allows you to get a little bit more to the point where you can get whatever you want with very small amount of gear.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. It's an interesting thing because at that point you're back to, shooting with flash at much lower shutter speeds in a way, because now you're controlling the ambient light versus the added flash almost independently, by deciding how long you keep the shutter open in a way. And of course, in your environment, in harsh sunlight, the rules are somewhat different compared to, let's say, where I live, where it's overcast most of the time. Although not today for some reason. Today we have Phoenix conditions here. But, which makes it difficult for me because I'm not used to shooting in like full on sunlight. Normally, with cloud cover, of course, when I'm shooting flash outside, I can shoot at lower shutter speeds and I can control the ambient light that way. So with a global shutter, what are the disadvantages of a global shutter? Because so far I can really only see advantages.
Well, there's obvious issues with a global shutter in that the technology is not to the point where they can turn. It's a power delivery, as far as I can tell. It's a power delivery issue where how do you deliver that much power to 24 million pixels at the same time? And so I think that the reason that they kept it at 24 megapixels is because that's as much as they can do right now. And I imagine that it will increase, and at some point they'll give you a 40 megapixel camera, and at some point they'll give you a 60 megapixel camera, because Sony has 60 megapixel cameras. But I don't think they're going to give you a global shutter on it, because how do you deliver 3 times the amount of power all at once? And I think the reason that they did the scan is because it's easier to deliver 1 pixel at a time really quickly than it is to try and just turn them all on and turn them all off at the same time. And so that's one of the negatives, is that you're going to have a smaller megapixel rating on the camera. So I went from a Canon R5, which has 40 some megapixels. So I went from almost 50 megapixels down to 24 megapixels. And I gave up the resolution in order to get the global shutter. And it was kind of a nail biter. I was like, it was kind of one of those equipment things. Like, do I need to take this extra equipment, right? So I was asking myself, what is more important? A bunch of megapixels, because I'm losing half of my resolution in order to get this global shutter. And in the end, I determined it doesn't matter, because I can shoot a much more beautiful photograph if I can control the light than if I have a whole bunch of megapixels. Because if I have a ton of megapixels, if I give me 100 megapixel camera, give me a medium format 100 megapixel camera with no flashes, with no lighting control, with no scrims, with nothing, and I've just got to go out and find great light. Yeah, I can find great light, but I'm gonna have to wait till a certain time of day, and I'm gonna have to go to a certain place, and I'm gonna have to be looking in a certain direction in order to get the perfect light that I want. Yeah, I can find it, but all those megapixels won't do me any good if I have to photograph at noon because that's when the client's available. And I have to photograph in this direction because that's what they want me to photograph. And so if I'm trying to create on demand, beautiful work, I need to be able to have light. I need to be able to control the light. And so I would much rather have a lower resolution, beautiful image with amazing light than I would a really high resolution image of crappy light. That's what I came to in my head. I was like, okay, well, clearly the lighting is what really matters in the photograph. And if I do a really beautiful job and I get a sharp image and I expose it right, all the AI tools that I have now to like clean up an image and to increase the size of the image, I can get my 24 megapixel back to 40 megapixels and print my, 20 by 30 or 30 by 40 print. I can do that with a 24 megapixel camera. But what I can't do is take a 100 megapixel camera that had no lights with it, and it was problematic because, I couldn't overcome the light, or I had to put on a whole bunch of neutral density filters to deal with the lighting. I can't take a bad lighting situation and make it better because I happen to have 100 megapixels. And so that was the calculus that I made when it came to what is the negative of the global shutter? And that truly is the negative, is that it's just 24 megapixels, which is
It-
funny because 24 megapixels was amazing back when I was,
yeah.
what, 2005? I was thrilled with 24 megapixels. I was like, oh my gosh, because I was shooting with 6 megapixels back in 2001.
Yeah, absolutely. 3.1, I
So,
remember, or
yeah.
3.2 or whatever it was. Yeah, 24 megapixels. I mean, this is the thing, the idiocracy about it, sometimes. I remember people telling me like, "Oh, how come you're shooting what was it, 24.5 megapixels or something? Well, how come you're not shooting, a higher resolution camera like a 45?" I'm like, "Well, I've shot billboard campaigns with
Yeah.
24 megapixels.
Right.
I mean, people have shot billboard campaigns with 12 megapixels. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's not, you know, it's not really. You can blow an image like that up so it goes on the side of a bus. It's not. That's not really the.
Right.
That being said, I caveat that by saying I recently changed to the Z8, and that's a 45 megapixel camera, and I'm really enjoying the extra resolution. The
Hmm.
detail, blah blah. I am enjoying it. Is it 100% necessary? No, because I spent 15 years or whatever shooting 24 megapixels, and I've been
Yeah,
happy.
the beauty of the megapixels is that you have the capability to go in and really fine tune and work with, uh, you know, things that are small, and you have the resolution to kind of manipulate. And but the negative side of, and this is another thing that I like about my new entry back, like my step back into the 24 megapixels, is that those pixel sizes are so big that they're allowing a lot more light into the camera. So each pixel is receiving a lot more light. So you've got some really clean shadows. There's not a lot of noise in the shadows because when you get to 40 and 50 and 60 megapixels, your shadows get pretty noisy. And that's a trade off for going higher in the megapixel because you just have these very tiny, tiny, tiny receptors for light. And it's better to have a bigger receptor for light, which is why the medium format cameras look so dang great, because they, even though they have 100 megapixels, they have very large receptors. And so they're receiving a lot of light. and it's providing the energy to the chip. So you're not manufacturing energy from a battery source. The light is the energy source. And so it's a very clean uh, experience. You're getting very clean images in the shadows because those receptors are so big. So there's that trade-off is when I get more megapixels, I get noisier images. And when I get less megapixels, I get cleaner images. And so I have really clean images at 24 megapixels. So that's a big value to me. And of course, as technology advances and we get cleaner and cleaner images. And then of course you add Adobe's ability to do the noise reduction with the AI. And man alive, when you do enhance inside of Lightroom or in Photoshop and you enhance an image with their I mean, it's clean.
Yeah.
So a noisy image is not a problem anymore. And, noisy images aren't problems anymore because of AI, and small megapixel images are not, problems because of AI. So there's so much that's solved as a result of post-processing AI that we can overcome some of those little challenges like, you know, uh, lower megapixels or, images have too many megapixels, so they're a little bit noisy. Like all that stuff can be overcome in post-production. But again, lighting can't be overcome in post-production.
Yeah.
You have to actually have good light.
And I think, the bottlenecks now that with modern cameras, the bottlenecks are really of a different kind. I think, nowadays it's more like, data delivery to SD cards, making sure they're fast enough to actually, record that amount of data at speed. So if you're a sports photographer, for example, imagine shooting at 100 megapixels if you're shooting sports, which is a great idea. But then now you need to be able to write that data to some card really fast without that overheating, and you need the power for it, so you need batteries that are powerful enough so they don't burn out 10 minutes into a shoot. So I think the bottlenecks nowadays with those kind of cameras, it's much more based around, in my view anyway, much more based around battery technology and things like, card reader and record technology and, data delivery and all that kind of stuff. Because
Well, and you're not joking about that sports stuff. The A9 III is really meant to be a sports camera. Like
right.
that's the point of the A9 III is it's supposed to be a sports camera, but I don't shoot sports. I shoot people and portraits and documentary stuff. And so to me it was kind of funny because everybody was talking about the global shutter as like this, you know, the panacea for sports photography because then you don't get the warping that happens because of the scan nature of the photo, which is true because I've photographed a lot of symphonies and like theatrical stuff, and if you're shooting with an electronic shutter where it's scanning across the image and you're doing it in silent mode so that you're not, causing problems for the people who are watching the performance because you got to be perfectly silent. When the conductor goes like that with his wand, it looks like a wet noodle.
Yes.
The wand is no longer straight; it goes like that. It just looks like he's just waving around a noodle that's wet, soggy noodle. And as a result of that, it's unusable. So you have to wait till they go like this and you take the picture when they're not moving because otherwise you'll get the wet noodle. And if you turn off your electronic shutter, then you're just ticking off all of the patrons that are watching the performance, especially when you're dealing with like orchestral stuff because it's really quiet. So everybody can hear what you're doing. So you want to be so it's perfect for the A9 III is perfect for working inside of like a theatrical performance. So that's where I use it. But I'm not a sports photographer at all. And my daughter plays soccer and my son plays baseball. And he did play a little football, like just kind of for fun. And so I would take the A9 III. I was like, oh, I've got a sports camera. I'm going to go take sports, which is ridiculous because I don't know the sports well enough to predict what's going on. And so I can't, I'm not a good sports photographer. In fact, I am not a sports photographer at all, because there's no predictive capability in my brain as to like, I'm going to predict where the ball's going to go. Um, which is a whole interesting discussion on itself. The what makes a good photographer is not knowledge of gear, because that can be, anybody can learn gear. Anybody can learn when to push something or how to set settings. It's just a memorization and a bit of muscle memory, and you're done. The real value of a photographer is your ability to understand the subject. That's it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And your inquisitiveness, like, so a good sports photographer understands this subject, and that's why that photographer is good at sports photography. They predict where the action's going to be. A good portrait photographer understands this subject and understands how to relate to the person in front of the camera and how to get them to feel comfortable, and how to, get them to smile, or how to get them to be serious, how to communicate with them. That's what makes a good portrait photographer. What makes a good documentary photographer is how well does the person relate to the subject that they're trying to document. If I know nothing about, medicine, and then I'm not going to be very good about documenting the process by which someone is, curing cancer. And so that's what creates a good photographer. And I'm horrible at sports because I can't predict it. But I go out there and shoot, and it has my camera, the A9 III has this ability to not only shoot at some insane frame rate, I think 120 frames a second of raw photos. So it's shooting in slow motion, but raw photos. And it has the ability to um, photograph what was in the past.
Oh, yeah.
Because as soon as you start focusing, it starts shooting. And then if you push the shutter, it keeps those and keeps going.
Yeah.
That way you don't miss what you were like, oh, as long as you have that shutter halfway down, it's collecting, like, I don't know, 20 frames in the past, and then
Yeah.
it goes forward in the future. The problem with that is I would come home with these insane number of photographs. Like, I would have, for every photo that I took of, some kind of action happening, I would have 300 photos of that one little action that happened.
Yeah.
And I'd have to scroll through all of them to find the precise moment. And it was helpful, but there was a lot of stuff I had to throw away, because so the post-production end of the capability of, shooting that many frames, and I'm glad they were only 24 megapixels, because if they'd been, 50 megapixels, I probably would have just blown my computer up. So there's a lot of trade-offs in that too. The better the technology on these cameras get, the more we have to, deal with issues on the computer on the other side, or storage, or, transfer speeds, or, so there's never a perfect situation. There's always some negative side to it, but
Well, just the ability of the autofocus system to, ensure that more frames are in focus. Like, for instance, here, an example I always give is, I shoot boxing now and again. And so, you know, um,
yeah, that's
I
gotta be
I
hard
would
to make sure that that's in focus.
well, because there's a lot of movement going on and there's a lot of blocking happening all the time, because people move around. But so typically, let's say I shoot about 3,000 images at an event, let's say, for argument's sake. Um, when I used to shoot this with an Nikon D750, which was a camera I loved, but of course, by modern standards, the autofocus system it doesn't really stack up to a Z8, for example. You know, um, so I would have naturally, I would say probably, I don't know, let's say I'd have 40% keepers. Let's just say that'd be perfectly in focus, usable. Um, and so let's say I get rid of 60% of images straight away, I'd cull them because they'd be out of focus or too soft or whatever. So it was relatively easy to bring that down to a manageable amount of shots that I can then either edit or deliver or whatever. The problem with the Z8 is, as much as I love that thing, now it generates about 98% of keepers because the autofocus system is so good. And now I'm not really culling that much. So now out of the 3,000 shots that I've actually shot, let's say 2,900 or something, are now actually perfectly in focus. And at that point, you go, ugh, have I just created way more work for myself? You know?
Well, and so I use AI to go through and cull.
Yeah.
And I don't trust the AI to make the decisions, but what I do is by giving AI the first look at the images, it pulls out the out of focus ones. It pulls out the ones that people are blinking or looking weird, that kind of stuff. And what it does is it color codes them and says, okay, if it's red, it's out of focus, don't worry about it. If it's, blue, it's just a repeat of something else. And it kind of gives you some color codes so that you can quickly look through the images and say, okay, well, I'm going to pay attention to those. And it used to be that when I would use this, I would get, I don't know, 10% of the images because I'm shooting wedding. I'm not shooting boxing. I was shooting weddings or portraits or whatever. So maybe 10% of the images might be soft on the eyes or something like that. And so it would just reject those out of hand. And then I would look at the other ones. Now, the last thing I shot a portrait session the other day and I ran it through the AI. There's not one red image, not one. Because everything is sharp and in focus because it's using the eye to track and it's so there's no out of focus images, which I'm like, is my AI working? Because I'm looking and there's no reds. Like that can't be right. So I scanned through and nope, it's just focuses that well. So there's no out of focus images. So it's funny that we're worried about the fact that it's a problem that we don't have out of focus images.
Yeah, I know it's weird, isn't it? But this is what I'm saying. It's like, you know, whilst it was relatively easy 10 years ago or something, it would have been relatively easy to say like, okay, well, I shoot sports, so therefore I need X camera because it does exactly what I need it to do. Or like, if you're, I don't know, if you're a macro photographer, you need a different type of camera, um, or whatever. But I think nowadays it's so much more difficult to really differentiate between different things because they're so good at doing so many different things. Um, that it just like I say, the bottlenecks are just now of a different nature, very often. Um, I
Yeah, that's why I've always said that people always ask me like, what do you shoot with? Because photographers are innately, gearhead kind of situation. Like we tend to like technology and we tend to like gear and we like the way something feels or we like the way, the buttons are organized or whatever. So we all have you know, this interest in gear. Um, but in the end, uh, one of my favorite quotes from Henri Cartier-Bresson is that photography is nothing, it's life that interests me. And that quote to me is like essential for like a baseline photographer. It's like what is photography really about? Because it's not about the gear. It's about life. It's about the subject in front of us. And so we get caught up in gear and we get caught up in technology and software and the ability to do things. But in the end, it's all about the subject matter and can we tell the story and can we, create the beauty and the art and can we, can we help show someone a piece of the world that they'll never get to go to? Like that's what photography is really about. But at the same time, you know, like said, there are certain tools that will help us do that better, which is why I chose the A9 III because that Sony's A9 III is its ability to allow me to completely control lighting is nothing else can do that. There are no other tools on the planet at the moment that can do that. I can't even use neutral density filters to do what the A9 III can do for me. And so there's no other tool on the planet right now that can do what this does. And so I'm able to do anything I want to, and I can control the light, and I can tell the story exactly the way I want to tell it. Um, but it's interesting that there are certain, as as uniform as cameras are, because I people ask me what my favorite camera was, and I shot with Canon for a long time, and I still have a couple cameras for their cinema line. So the 5RC is a really good camera for video. But I stopped using the Canon line for portraits because I wanted the ability to control the light better. And so that's why I'm on this Sony camera. But there are other camera makers that have completely different, unique capabilities. Like, for instance, the Fuji line. Nothing can compare to Fuji's color. Just, I mean, it's just fantastic the way they have engineered color, but they're not super great at focusing. They're a little slower, a little clunkier, but they're amazing with color, you know? So I've got this A9 III Sony, which allows me to completely control light. And then I've got a Fuji camera that is amazing with color. And then I've got this Canon camera that's really great with its video. So like every camera maker has something that they offer that's completely different from somebody else. And so in the end, if someone ever asks me what the best camera is or who the best camera maker is, I can't tell you because I'm agnostic. I don't know, because each one has a unique skill set that the other ones don't have. Because everybody just kind of they focus on this thing, you know, and so
Yeah.
so I don't think there's an answer for what kind of camera. It really is just each camera has its own capabilities, and you choose the camera based on what you need to accomplish, you know, and most of them can accomplish anything. Like you could hand me any camera. Doesn't matter what camera you hand me, I can accomplish the goal. I just have to change the way I'm doing it. Um, and if you give me the right lights, I really don't care what camera you give me. I can create a really great image because I can control the light. And I don't care if it's a 6 megapixel camera, and I don't care if it was made in 2004. I can create a great image out of that if you give me the lights.
I always, the comparison I always draw is like, you can give a carpenter any old hammer, they'll just fashion you some amazing thing out of wood because they know how to do it.
Right.
Whether they have the latest, like, I don't know, hammer made by a Swiss design company, who knows? I know nothing about hammers, but or a or a hammer that was made in 1812. It's still a hammer,
Right.
and it's still a
Right.
tool, and they know what they're doing, and so hence they can create the thing that they need to create. Yeah, but maybe with a modern tool, it's faster, it's more efficient, um, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it. You know, it's ultimately it's a tool. I always think of the perfect camera as, what's the perfect camera for you, depending on what it is that you need, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Because I'm a great believer of shooting with intent, and thinking about what
Yeah.
your intention is, and you'll pick the right tool, for the job. Like, I don't know, if I want to go out and do some street photography, I'm very unlikely to take out a Z8. I'm actually much more likely to take out a much smaller camera, maybe something that's a lot more um, portable, you know, and maybe inconspicuous or whatever, and maybe something that limits me in some way, maybe with a fixed lens, something like that, one focal length, that sort of thing, depending on what it is that I'm trying to do. Maybe even film. There, I said it. You know, it, so it just depends on what the intent is. Like if I'm really stressed out and I go into town, I want to just do a little bit, have some fun, do a little bit of street photography. I take an old medium format camera with me and I shoot film because it slows the process down, and I just like doing it. I like the process, you know. Um, that's very different from when I'm shooting a commercial job because there is something very specific I have to accomplish, particular lights I need to use, and I have a client breathing down my neck, and I want to see
Right.
results
Yeah.
like yesterday.
And
So,
and and it can't be a discovery process. Like,
right.
commercial cannot be a discovery. Personal work should be discovery, but I think commercial work, when you're being paid to be on and you're being paid to create at the moment that they want you to create, it can't be a discovery process. It has to be a on demand. I can be creative. I take all the tools that I have and I take all of the knowledge and the discovery that I've done in the past, and I pick and choose the things I've learned from that discovery for the moment that I need to create. And I say, okay, this is the skill set I have. This is the knowledge I have. These are the tricks that I have in my tool set. And so I'm being paid right now in this hour to do this shot. I'm going to take all that and I'm just going to create something within my lane that I know how to do. And then tomorrow, when I'm not being paid and I'm out on the street discovering, that's when I'm going to discover and fail and try to do things differently. And that's when I'm going to be the artist and I'm going to figure out what my new tool is or what my new, ability is. And then the next time I'm being paid to shoot, now I have this extra thing that I can pull in for the moment that I'm being paid to do something where I cannot fail.
And that's why personal projects are so super important in my view. It's because then you're
Mm.
creating the environment where you can actually experiment and try out different things. And that will then translate into the next commercial thing that you have to do because now your toolbox of tricks is now so much larger and you can now create more things on demand. This is why I don't know. This is why I personally like to work on personal projects and do things that really serve no other purpose other than, me being able to experiment a little bit and try out different things. Film being
Yeah,
one of
and
those.
I think personal projects don't necessarily even have to be like if you're a portrait photographer, that doesn't mean your personal project needs to be on portraits. You don't
Exactly.
have to go hire a model and I mean you do. If you need to learn lighting, you'd better have somebody to light on or a mannequin or something
Yeah.
to learn that. But that's almost a skill set. The personal projects to me is what are you interested in outside of the thing that you're doing? Because I tend to find that personal projects for me are things like street photography and landscape photography. Those are the things that I get really excited about.
Yeah.
And so when I'm out shooting something, landscape oriented, I'm discovering compositions. And then when I go back into doing portraits or weddings or documentary stuff, I tend to then take that lesson that I've learned about landscape photography and I employ it into the portrait. And so the landscape and the portrait start to merge. And so I don't think they have to be personal projects that are perfectly related to the things that we shoot. It's just
Yeah.
all information, all all points of discovery lead us to better work in every aspect of what we do. I don't even think I I'm convinced also that I don't think that you have to personal projects don't even have to be photography. They
Correct.
could be
Yeah.
anything. They could be going to a museum and looking at painting. That's one of the most fascinating things for me to do is look at sculpture. I love to take a camera and go to a museum and just photograph beautiful sculpture because you have this they've put it in a museum, they've got it lit, and there's just this silky nature to the marble and I love to just walk around a three-dimensional sculpture and just see how incredible the sculptor was in, you know, making the skin look pliable, and uh, how translucent something can be.
Also, the thing about sculptures, the thing that fascinates me about sculptures is posing. So, I always think like,
Yeah, yeah.
if you create a sculpture out of marble, let's say, or stone or something, you got to think very, as a sculptor, you got to think very hard and long about your model's pose. Because ultimately, there's no way back. Once you've chiseled that arm out of marble, there's nothing you can do to
It's
change that.
done.
It's done. Yeah. So,
And it's done in 3 dimensions, which is crazy because
exactly.
at least as photographers, we get to force perspective, and so we get to say, "This is the only way you get to look at this pose, and it looks great from this angle, but all
Yeah,
other angles, it would look stupid."
exactly.
The sculptor is like, "Well, it looks great from this angle, but it's horrible from the other angle, so I better,"
Yeah, and
uh
that's why I love that because because you actually have the opportunity to walk around or in
Mhm,
three-dimensional space, and look at that sculpture from different angles actually, and it teaches you a lot. I mean, certainly for me as a portrait photographer, it's taught me a lot about posing, because
mhm,
you sort of go back and you kind of, there's always the question why is to me is always the most important question. Like, why has the artist chosen this particular pose? And discovering that and thinking about that actively will then inform the way that you potentially pose your own models in the future, the way you light them, the way you pose them, the way you shoot them, the angles, and so on, because you've made that sort of active you made the discovery through active thought beforehand, and that then becomes part of your arsenal and your ammunition. The next time you think about creating something, because this is the thing. One of the issues I always have with students in particular is that the technicalities of lighting are relatively straightforward in a sense. The technical part of lighting is something that is not necessarily that difficult to teach. The creative application of that technical part of it, that in a sense is the hard part because,
yeah.
some and again, I use this comparison a lot of times or very often on this podcast. Think of it as a sort of as a spectrum, online where you have people who are very technically minded on one end of the spectrum and people who are super creative on the other side of the spectrum. And ideally, you'd sort of think, well, probably the ideal place would be somewhere in the middle where you have, technical expertise, but also high creative thought,
Right.
But we all know people who are super technical and really lack in the creative department. And then on the other extreme, you know people who are super mega creative, but just have no clue about anything to do with any technology whatsoever you know, so, and I always think that it's probably I mean, to me, it's always been easier to sort of teach the technical side of things, and I often find, especially when I let's say when I talk in, like, camera clubs, I often find that the creative thing is the thing that's sometimes lacking, and coming back to sculptures in particular and paintings, I love the National Portrait Gallery that we have here in London. It's a beautiful gallery, full with the old masters and loads of incredible portraiture, and the National Gallery as well, which is just amazing paintings in general. You can spend so much time in there just looking at. I mean, I annoy my wife. I think I drive her insane by constantly just harping on about the lighting in an image. When she's just like, "Oh, it's a beautiful painting." Yes, but can you see the way that light's skipping across the bridge of the nose? And the way
She's
it's
like, "Oh, shut up."
yeah, exactly. Shut up. It's a person, you know. But she'd be like, "Oh, what a
Yeah.
beautiful dress," and I'm like, "Yeah, but
Although I was at the National Gallery there in London, in March of last year, and I was so disappointed at how few Caravaggios they had.
oh, okay,
I was very disappointed. I was like, because anytime I go to a museum, that's like the paintings I want to see.
yeah,
Because like his ability and his like just the drama that he creates is like I love him. And I was like, oh. no Caravaggios at all. Like, well, a couple, but you know,
Yeah.
so
With some of the museums here, I think they've probably stolen so much stuff over the last few centuries, they have to give stuff back, maybe that's what it is.
maybe they gave them all back to Italy.
It's like, you
Oh,
know
by the way, we took this.
yeah, so, the British Empire has a lot to answer for, If you look at the British Museum, for example, which is phenomenal, I mean, it really is phenomenal, um, but I don't even wanna think about how they got hold of all the stuff that's in there,
Yeah.
over the last, like, 300 years or something, oh, well. But yeah.
One of the best museums for sculpture, though, is in Italy. It's called the Borghese Museum. It's just this little tiny museum, kind of north of the city center in a park, and it's like an old cardinal's house, and it has so many amazing, beautiful sculptures, Bernini's, and I mean, just the it's got the um, it's got the sculpture. I forget who the players are, but it's like the sculpture where uh, there's the god. I don't remember which god it is, but anyway, it's the the god is trying to um, he's like he's like grabbing the girl and he's dragging her down. I think it's the rape of something, rape of some somebody. Anyway, so he's grabbing her and he's pulling her down, and she's trying to fight it, and at the same time, she's turning into a tree
Oh, okay.
to kind of like defend herself. She's becoming a tree instead. It's almost like she's just changing from human to tree so that she doesn't have to experience this thing. And anyway, so it's just this massive struggle, and this and his hand is pushing into like her flesh, and you can see it, and it looks like if you touched it, your hand would go in. It's so soft, and then her her fingers are turning into a tree, and the leaves are so thin that you can see the light coming through them.
Oh, wow, okay.
And I'm like, how many times did he chip off a leaf, because he was like chiseling on it and he's like trying to make it. And then all of a sudden, bing, oh crap, I've got to, oh, dang it.
Yeah.
We must have had like 5,000 leaves and he lost half of them. But it's the most amazing sculpture. Anyway, that whole museum is just filled with the most incredible sculptures. I don't know how they got all those sculptures in one place, but it's fantastic. And it's really tiny. It's, I don't know, 5 rooms total of art, and the art's all over on the walls, and then these sculptures are throughout but it's the greatest sculpture gallery I've ever been to. So I think it's called the Borghese.
Is it in Florence, did you say?
No, it's in Rome.
Oh, in Rome, okay.
Yeah. It's just north of the city center in Rome. And there's a park, and then there's this old cardinal's house, and I think it's called Borghese. I'm probably butchering the name, but Borghese, I think. Yeah.
If I can find a link to it, I will put in the description. Um,
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's the great. If you're ever in Rome, you have to go there, but you have to set up an appointment. You can only go by appointment. You can't just walk into it. So, but it's a great museum.
that's something to check out. I mean, I know I've seen lots of, really interesting galleries, and museums in Florence. This is quite a long time ago. But if anybody interested in, especially in statues, there's a lot to see there. Um, I want to talk to you a little bit about photography education and the way that that's changed over the last, maybe over the last 10 years, but in particular, maybe over the last sort of, 4 or 5 years, um, with with the event of things like initially YouTube, online education, and now, of course, the advent of AI. What's your sort of impression generally of how photography education in general has changed?
Well, I think photography education has been changing constantly for 30, 40 years. Because I remember when I was first learning photography, and that was in, I would say the first time I started actively learning anything about photography, it was uh, 1990, 1990, I'd say. That's when I first started learning about photography. I was a senior in high school, and I started, messing around with cameras, and I found them interesting. I was a theater major in college when I first started, and so I just took a photography class. And back then, photo education was simply you either went to a school or you went to maybe a workshop in Santa Fe, or you went to a convention center and you learned photography there, or you went and bought a book, right? You bought a really thick, heavy book about photography, and it would show you a picture, and then it would tell you what the settings were and how light works. And there would always be like this prism that showed you how light splits up into, the different uh, primary colors. And then there'd be another page that showed you like f-stops, and there'd be a series of photos that showed you, depth of field, scales, and it was very technical, and every book that you ever got on photography had the worst photography in it.
That's totally true.
It
100%.
was uninventive, uninteresting, not beautiful. It was just very uh, technical, and you could tell that the person who had written the book was very technical, and maybe they had the skills to create beautiful work, but they weren't going to waste their work on this book. And that's kind of what I've come to. At first, I thought maybe none of these people are very artistically inclined. They're just very technical. And that may be true. But then a lot of those books, I think that they're like, well, I don't want to waste or put my best work in this book because then it's kind of out in the public. And I want my best work to be something that I sell on the side, on prints or whatever. I'm not sure what the reason, but I don't think I ever saw a beautiful book. And so I would leaf through these books and I was like, yeah, okay, the technical stuff is there, but I'm not seeing anything worth buying this book for so that I can see it. So I bought Ansel Adams's books on like the negative and the print, and because his work was beautiful and informative. And that's kind of what I was interested in at the time anyway. But it was all books. And then as I got closer to like 2000, then we started seeing like DVD education coming out. And so I would go to a conference, and at that time I was starting a business, and I was running this business. I think I started my business about 2000 or 1997 is when I started actually doing business. And I was shooting weddings and portraits, and I would go to things like WPPI, and I would see, these great photographers, and I would get excited about it, and I'd buy a DVD and I'd take it home and I'd watch the DVD, and that's the way education was. So you had there was a barrier to entry to education because you had to print a book, you had to print a DVD, and you had to make 1,000 of them in order to make it worth the the time and effort and the money in order to get the cost of the DVD down so that you could sell it at a reasonable price. So that barrier to entry meant that you actually had to not only have something to say and be worth the educational, investment, but you had to believe in yourself. You had to have enough of a following that you knew that it would come up, people would buy it. And so I would say that the education was pretty solid education. Um, might not be the most artistic education, but it was pretty solid technical education. And then came the uh, advent of like online education. And online education came from fairly big players. You know, you had Creative Live and places like that. There was still a gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper always has been um, the gatekeeper has always had the role, whether it was a physical gatekeeper, whether it was, you know, a cost gatekeeper, or whether it was an actual person that was the gatekeeper deciding whether you were worth, you know, listening to. Those gatekeepers had the effect of making sure that there was something worth being said and the information was generally correct, and that helped to maintain like the bar of education. um and then came the obliteration of the gatekeepers, because things became so easy to do. So now, today, we've got, you know, you can do it on Rumble, you can do it on YouTube, you can do it on Facebook, you can do it like, it doesn't matter where you are. Most of the services are completely free. So there's no cost. We don't have to, you know, make DVDs. We don't have to print books. If we print books, we can print them on demand so people can buy them you never actually make a book until someone buys it. Like, everything is completely open, and there's no barrier to entry except I need a little vlogging camera and I need an internet connection. And that's pretty much all I need. And so, as a result of that, pretty much anybody can enter into the sphere. And I think it's had two effects. Number one, technical has gone way down. The understanding of technical and uh, the ability to communicate real education has gone down. And I wouldn't say the number of great educators has gone down. I would just say that the percentage across the board of great educators has gone down, because there's so many more people that have entered in the field. But what I will say is that the amount of artistic innovation has gone way up, because I see amazing people doing amazing things just with phones. Like, you'll see like the little Instagram feeds of the guy that goes and creates a really cool effect with his phone, and he does like 5 in a row or something like that. And that's his whole feed, is just cool things I did with my phone. And you know that he's done about 1 million and only 5 worked out. But he's recorded every single one of them. And he's failed probably 1,000 times a day, but he got 5 that were really cool. So he posts them that day. And then that's all he does all day, is just do these crazy ideas with his phone. But the artistic nature of what people are doing is amazing, because there's no barrier to entry. And so this person that's really good at this one little thing has the ability to just post it all out there. Um, and so I think we have all of this great conceptual work going on. I don't know that those same people that are doing amazingly artistic and inventive work could necessarily teach it very well,
Ah,
because they
yes.
don't know the technical. They don't know how they did it. They just know that it works, and they don't know why it works. Or they'll explain it and they think they know why it works. And so they'll explain the concept of like lighting. They're really good at lighting. You know, they can manipulate the light and look at the way it looks, and they're inventive and they're artistic and they make beautiful work. But then when they try and explain to you how it's working or why it's working, they're completely off base and they have no idea what they're talking about.
And the thing there is that there's a number of things to unpack. One is this. I completely agree with you. There's been an explosion of creative application, let's say, where people use very simple things like a phone, for example, to create all these interesting things, like in not only in stills photography but also in video. If you think TikTok, if you take TikTok as an example, the things that people do in terms of video editing, for example, with shorts and all sorts of different creative things, incredible. And I think to a degree, creativity spawns creativity because some people will look at something and go, "Whoa, this is really cool. Oh, I have an idea where how I can take this even further." And so it sort of just generates creativity, which is phenomenal. And of course, the one of the main or major elements in that is access. So now that we can access all of that because it may very well have been that 10 years ago, before the advent of TikTok and Instagram or whatever, there may have been somebody being super creative, but we would have just never known about it, because we would have never
Right. They would have been
found that guy.
doing this stuff anyway,
Yeah,
but they wouldn't have been broadcasting it, so no one would have
exactly.
seen it. And I
Exactly.
think you're right on that idea of seeing it. It's just seeing that someone has done something is an education in itself.
Yeah. And it's
Like you and I walking around a museum looking at a sculpture, it's not like the sculptor is alive and telling us what they did,
exactly.
but we're being educated as we look at work, even if the master or the teacher that tells us about that, we don't need a teacher to show us something or tell us something to be inspired. And that inspiration is its own teacher. But then
Yeah.
if you want to repeat and you're like, why does that work? Now you need a teacher.
Yes. And of course, on the flip side of that, it can also trigger that need to reverse engineer something because this is one of the ways that I learn, and I have learned a lot. Not only in photography but also in music. Is reverse engineering things and thinking, seeing something and going, how did they do that? Now I want to find out. I want to find out how that came to be. Like I remember when I first got into like off-camera lighting, for example. I used to constantly think like, okay, I wonder how was that lit? Where was the light? What was the light source? How many light sources were there? What modifiers were used? Where would they have been? How would they have created this environment? How did they balance this? What was the color temperature? You know, and I would literally deconstruct an image, trying to figure out how it was done, and then try and fail many times, of course. But that's how you learn. Ultimately, you try, you fail, you go, why did that not work? And then you try and figure it out. Um, to me, that's always been a very useful way of a very slow process, by the way. It would have been much easier if there had been somebody who would have gone like, well, this is actually how you do it. But I always
Right.
feel that I've learned a lot. In a sense, I've learned a lot more by failing. You know, because a lot of the time it'd be like, "Oh, that didn't work, but it did something else that I didn't do, that I didn't know would happen, and now I've learned that." So
Right. So you add that to your kit, even
yes.
though that wasn't the purpose of your exploration.
Yeah, and often, a lot of time, I would think like I would look at a picture and I'd be like, back in the day, I was like, I know how they did that, and so I'd try and recreate it and be like, I'd be completely off the path, and I'd be like, oh shoot, that didn't. But actually, the result I got was actually quite interesting. In fact,
Right.
I can argue that a lot of the stuff that I do now has actually been the result of failure.
Yeah, I think that that's a part of education that's often missing in the photographic world. Um, because think about what we do for education now. So for education now, it's less about going to a long form class, where we're interacting with someone on a regular basis, like a teacher or a master or something like that, or we're not going and apprenticing with someone for a long period of time. What we're doing is we're watching a YouTube video, and we might be getting the same guy. Like someone might be watching the same feed all the time, so they're seeing the same stuff and the same education. Someone might be watching my education, on a regular basis, but it's just a one-way communication, and
Yes.
they're not sitting in front of me in a class for a week. They're doing it for a day. Even if they come to a seminar, and I think one of the major shortfalls of seminars today is that we go to some place like WPPI and they give you 60 minutes, 90 minutes. 90 is a long class, apparently. And yet, all I can do is give people a burst of information and then they leave. They're not educated. They're not educated at all. All they have is a bunch of notes and they're freaking out because they got maybe 30% of the fire hose that I was shooting at them. And they hope that they'll be able to go home and try and sort it out. And half the time that notebook goes into a closet and never gets looked at again until like 5 years later. And then they're like, oh, I think I'm ready to try and learn that thing that Jared was talking about. And the technology's changed and they can't remember exactly what I was saying. And so that's kind of where education is right now, where there's a lot of information coming to the student, to the learner. But what you just talked about was the idea of the practice element. And so, like, I can teach you technical things and you can go home and you can kind of, try and parse it out. But there's the other element of education, which is the why, and which is the not the technical practice, but the artistic practice and the comfort level practice and the like when you're doing a portrait, I can teach you the technical reasons why you put the light here and what power you put the light at. And if everything maintains consistency, I could actually tell you, put your camera at f3.8, put your shutter speed at, 250th of a second, and put your your ISO at 400, and then turn on a lamp right here on the right hand side and put like, I can tell you everything to do, and then you can go home and just repeat it. But the idea of teaching someone how to communicate with the person that's in front of the camera and how to make them feel comfortable and how to chat with them
Mm.
so that they're not concerned about the way they look, and how to just watch for them until their pose is correct, and then just be like, okay, now stay where you are, just like that. Or, like coaxing out an expression from someone, like you're going through this process of trying to connect with someone fast enough that they'll give you stupid looks and goofy looks and over the top looks. That's a hard thing to do because they got to trust you really quickly. You can't teach someone that in a technical way.
Yeah.
You have to interact with them, and then they have to go home and practice it.
Yeah.
And it's in the practice that they're going to learn how to do. It's the do and then repeat and then ask questions and then repeat and then try it again and repeat and then ask some more questions. And so it requires, I think, three things. Number one, they have to know the technical. Number two, uh, there has to be some kind of um, exhibit of how to do this. So there has to be like an example given so that they can kind of watch and soak in what's happening. And then they have to go and practice it and get comfortable with it. And they have to be able to ask questions about that. And they have to be able to go back to the mentor and say, this isn't working. Why isn't it working? Well, let me watch you do it. Okay, now the reason it's not working is because you are forcing it, or, whatever. And so, but the practice of it is what we're totally missing, because that's the only way that you learn the the ins and outs of how you do this, and the feel for how you do this. And it's actually the only way you learn from the failure. Like you were saying, you've got to fail in order to learn. I think you have to fail over and over and over
Yeah.
so that you know what doesn't work and you figure out why it didn't work, you know, even technically.
Yeah, and to develop like a breadth of a volume of vocabulary almost, to fine tune things. Like for instance, portrait photography, especially if we're talking about photographing humans, there's such a wide gamut of different personality types, and that you really need like a broad vocabulary in a sense of because, two people are never the same in the way that you can communicate with them, and I think as a portrait photographer, that's is super important to be able to communicate with your subject.
And that's exactly the problem, is that the the most critical element to at least photography that has to do with people, human connection photography, which is where most of the money exists.
Yeah.
So if you want a business, you have to be photographing people in some way, shape, or form, generally speaking. Um, but the problem is that that's not the sexy thing.
Yeah.
There's nothing sexy and exciting about the process of learning how to talk to somebody.
Exactly. Yeah,
You know
absolutely.
what I mean? Like, can you imagine if I went to some place like imaging or WPPI or whatever, and I said, and I gave them, because for this is inside baseball, but for people who don't know how to get on the platform and be able to speak, you basically put together a treatise of what you're going to say and who's willing to sponsor you, and then you turn it into WPPI or PPA or NAB or whoever's doing the program. Um, and then they decide whether or not they think enough people are going to want to watch that performance, and then they give you a stage. Well, the problem is that if you say, I'm going to go on stage and I'm going to tell people, not I'm not going to talk to people about how to light or how to shoot, or I'm not going to bring a model on stage that's sexy, that, dances around and is wearing next to nothing. And I'm going to, no, I'm going to bring an old man out of the audience. I'm just going to choose somewhat random, and then I'm going to talk to them. They're not get no one's gonna book that.
Well,
And
so
so it's not sexy enough. And so
yeah,
people are, and plus the education that you're talking about, that education of trying to teach someone how to interact with a human, is not a 60-minute or a 90-minute thing. It's a week long back and forth between you and the person. It's you watching them. It's them sitting and watching you for a week worth of all these portrait sessions. It's a long process. And so it takes too long, and it's not sexy enough. And so it doesn't get on the platform. People aren't going to be able to watch it because the gatekeeper is saying, not sexy. No one's going to want to watch it.
and the funny thing is, I did that in 30 minutes at the photography show on stage, which was, not a lot of time. It is
Yeah.
probably one of my major criticisms about that as a show, just generally. There are many great aspects about the photography show that I love. The fact that the stages are open, they're part of the
Right.
expo floor. You can discover a lot of education there, rather than it being
Yeah.
tucked away in separate rooms and stuff. I love that open feel. It's like the,
Mhm.
the difference between having a kitchen that's in a separate room and having like an open plan living space.
Right.
From a communication point of view. But the education sessions are very short. They're like 30 minutes tops, and
Right.
it's like you said earlier, it does very much limit in what you can do. And I can see their side of it. They want to cram as much as possible into those 4 days across the various stages and everything. But
And people don't have the attention span for something longer than 20 or 30 minutes, especially in that circumstance.
yeah, but you can't really get very much to the bones of it. That's the thing. That's what I found. I mean, I can create a rapid fire version of it, which is gonna be fun and entertaining, and that. But you can't, like I said, you can't really get to the detail of it. Um,
Yeah, and what you just did is you gave people a taste,
yes,
and you said, "This is the general idea. Go home and try and repeat it."
yeah. Or
And
what I
and
should
and
have
that's
done.
great. Like, they get to go home and try and repeat it, but they're gonna have to fail and fail and fail and fail and try, and then only the very tenacious among them are going to do it enough to figure out how you did it, or figure out how they should do it and their own version of it, because they'll have failed and tried again and failed. And most people are going to go home try it once and say, well, that doesn't work. He's just lying about it. Right? It'd be like, you didn't give me the real information. You
Yeah.
just kind of pretended that that's what you do, because
Yeah.
they couldn't do it right off the bat.
And now you've just given me an idea, and I wish oh man, I should have thought about this before I did that. Dang it. Because what I should have done is I should have actually had like a full class ready and available for people to purchase afterwards. So they could, I would have given them a taster and I could have then sent them to, I don't know, my website and they could have purchased the whole thing. Oh man, why didn't I think about that beforehand?
So
Dang it.
that reminds me of a story. There's a guy, and I don't even remember what his name was, but it was, I think it was around 2010 or 12, or maybe somewhere around there. There was a guy that was going to all the speaking circuits, and he was going to PPI, and he was going to WPPI and PPA, and he was big in the wedding industry, and he he just was he was on fire when it came to presentation. Like, he was so magnanimous, and he was just poetic, and like everybody just loved. He had 1,000 people in his room, no problem. People were just like on fire, and they were just like, it was like watching the Beatles, and like people would come in there and they were just like dancing to him. They were just so excited, and he was really good at working the audience up, and like he was a presenter, but he was kind of a snake oil salesman too. Like, he had good photography, but he didn't know what he was doing with it. Like, he had no technical knowledge or ability when it came to like teaching that technical knowledge. He didn't know what he was doing. He was just doing something. And he was really good at speaking. And so he would kind of flower up what he was doing, and tell people about it, and get people jazzed about the idea of doing this thing. But he never actually would tell them anything. And
Right.
people would leave his classes just completely frustrated, because they they liked his work and they loved listening to him, but they would leave and they didn't know what it was that they had just heard. And they didn't know how to repeat what he was doing. They didn't know what it was he was doing. And at the end of his classes, at the very end, he would just say, and if you want to know how I do all this, go buy a DVD. And there were doing DVDs at the back end. And he actually got banned from speaking at these places, because then that's what I think that's when they instituted the rule that you can't sell from the platform, because people are so angry, because he would like, buy the DVD, and then he would, leave. It was the funniest thing. I mean, it was hilarious that people got so excited. It was literally looked like those old 50s, where the girls were just fainting in the aisles, you know? People were totally bought into it. It was a religion. And it
Oh,
was
wow.
so funny to watch, because there was no education happening. It was just a cult of personality.
Yeah.
And I think to some degree we get that all the time. There's a cult of personality amongst a lot of people. There's so many great educators out there that are really good at what they do, and like there's a whole series of like the basically the new Canon Explorer of Lights, Explorers of Light. Um, that A lot of them are my friends, and they're so good at what they do, and they're innovative, and they're good teachers. So they really have a great lineup of people. And I think that's true of most of the camera makers. Sony has a good lineup. Fuji has a few really good people that teach. Nikon has a few really great people that teach. And all of them are so great, and their personalities are great. But unfortunately, what happens is and it must be frustrating to them too. It's not just frustrating to all the educational sphere. It's not that I'm saying, oh, these people are snake oil salesmen. The one I was talking about was, but these guys and ladies and men that are teaching now for the camera makers are really quite good at what they do, and they're good teachers. I think that the camera makers have realized that they need to have people who know how to communicate, and so they have them. but it must be frustrating to them, to the teachers themselves, that a lot of what goes on is this cult of personality, and people latch onto them because they're interested in their personality, because that's kind of the sales. That's what makes you interesting to the camera maker, because you have a following, of,
Yeah.
100,000 people or whatever are following you. So they're interested in sponsoring you. Um, but it must be frustrating to someone like that who has a cult following and people aren't listening to what they're saying. They're just following them and they want to shoot like them, but they don't listen to the lesson. They listen to, and that one of the reasons that when I'm teaching a workshop, I the people will always ask me when I come in to teach the workshop, they're like, what do you want for a model? And then they show me a bunch of people that are beautiful people. And I'm like, that's the problem. And so I said, I don't want any beautiful models. I want like an old man, or I want to pull someone out of the audience, because my experience has been that when people get excited about a workshop and they're there and there's a beautiful girl or a hot guy, or a guy and a girl that are just so hot, they just want to put it on their website as like an example of their work. So they're so excited about shooting this thing, and they're so excited about looking at the person, that they won't learn what they're supposed to learn. They don't learn the lighting, and they don't learn the posing, and they don't, because they're so interested in taking a picture that they'll just boo 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 boo, and they haven't even
Yeah.
checked their lighting. They don't even know if the exposure is correct, and they're shooting because they're into this, just the hype of what's in front of them. They're into the hype of the person that's teaching. They're into the hype of the model that's in front of them, and they're so excited that they're learning nothing.
Yeah, and often the driver is, Instagram, for example, So I always find that, um, it's like you said, the thing about shooting very beautiful models, it's not hard to get a good result with somebody who's a professional model, is really good looking. They know how to move. They know exactly, they give you everything you need without you having to say anything because they're professionals. That's what you would expect that, right?
They
But really,
stare at a mirror all day long to figure out how they look best.
exactly, and they've seen a million photos of themselves, so they know exactly what
Right.
to do. What's much more difficult is to photograph somebody who's very rarely ever been in front of a lens, because you actually, as a photographer, you have to do the hard work. You have to give the direction. You have to tell your subject what to do. That's much harder than
But
just,
that's hard work.
it's hard work, but it's also where this communication thing comes in, because I know this from teaching lighting workshops. Um, with with people who are not necessarily used to actually photographing humans, to start with, which is kind of why they're there, because they want to learn how to do it. Um,
Right.
but it's this, when it's somebody's turn to shoot, a lot of people become very quiet and withdrawn, almost, because maybe they're embarrassed, or they don't really know what to say, and so therefore they sort of, you know withdraw, back inside of themselves. Um, And what I always find interesting is to actually then to look at it from the model's perspective. What, as a model, what do you need from the photographer? And as a photographer, once you know that, that gives you a really great insight in what it is that you need to deliver, and what you need to do. And once in my experience anyway, once I've worked with somebody a number of times, and you get to know each other a little bit, then you kind of really know, you get a really good sense of how much freedom to give somebody. What, like, I get to the point where I know what I can rely on with that person, because so in order to make the whole process more creative, and also more efficient, and for it to flow better. But these are all things that you learn with experience, you know,
Right.
uh, and that's
Yeah,
that's
and
that's the thing.
it's unfortunate that that's kind of lacking in the educational, because again, it's that same problem of uh, short. and sexy is what gets on stage.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the best education that someone can have. The best education that someone could have is to go to a longer form workshop, something like a Santa Fe workshop or a couple days at least, where you have an interaction with a mentor, with a teacher, and someone who's not trying to sex it up, but rather trying to give you real world experiences where you will fail, where you'll have to be inventive, and where you can go back to the teacher and say, why am I not getting this right? Whether it's technical or whether it's interactive or whether it's what is your vision? Like all of those things need to be part of the educational model. And the, in order to have a really good education in photography, it has to take a little longer. It has to be a little bit more painful for the learner, and it has to have less less sex and more practical knowledge in it. And it has to have lots of opportunities for failure. And none of those things are super attractive to the person who would benefit from them. And so there's there's a really bad situation because the learner is not getting what they need because they would never pay to go do the thing that they need. It's like it's like going to a gym, you know? Person I want to be more fit and I want to feel better. And so the only way to do that is to have a guy at the gym teach me how to cause myself pain. Why would I pay someone to teach me how to be in pain and hobble around because my muscles are torn and like why would I do that? Well, if I want to be good at fitness, I need to go through a little pain and I need to work out. That just doesn't sell in the photography community because people want to just go, they want an easy fix. They want to go to a workshop where they are beautiful models are put in front of them, the lights are set for them, and then they take pictures over the shoulder of the professional who's trying to teach them, but they're just like shooting. They're not even listening to what the professional is telling them. And then when they get home, they have a one beautiful photo out of 3,000 that they took. They don't know how they made it, but they get to put it on their website. And that's the educational model today. And that's why I say it must be very frustrating for to be uh, you know, a Canon professional that's teaching Explorer of Light. I go out to some amazing location and Canon has brought in the models and whatever. And it's got to be super frustrating to to try and teach people who aren't even listening because they're so excited about what's in front of them. And the only way to change that is to force people into a situation where they don't get the easy fix. And it doesn't sell as well, but it is effective. And I've taught workshops like that where we we put people on in the fire, and it's painful and it's difficult, but by the end of the week, they actually know what they're doing and they can repeat. They can leave and they can repeat that process because they have gone through the fire and they've had that 4 or 5 days of constant interaction with their mentor and teacher, but also with the fire where they're experiencing the pain of failure. And then they can come back to the drawing board and there's this kind of back and forth. That's the best educational model. So it's a difficult situation.
Exactly. No pain, no gain, as they say.
No pain, no
In
gain.
turn, no pain, no gain. Actually, this could very well be the title of this episode. No pain,
That's
no
right.
gain.
No pain, no gain. In
That's it.
fact, wrapping it back around. So when I lost all of my cameras in Florence when I was young, um, that was so basically a bunch of hooligans stole my cameras in Florence, and that was my entrance into the professional world because they stole all my cameras. And when I got back to the United States, I had insurance and I had a I had like an old Leica M3. Didn't even have a light meter on it, right? It was just a super old camera. But my insurance had to pay me for replacement value, which meant that I got like a check from the insurance company for like $15,000. And I'd only spent like, I don't know, $2,000 on the entire bag of gear. But because they had to replace everything with new gear, I got like $15,000. So I was able to go and buy a medium format camera, which is what was necessary in order to be a quote unquote professional photographer. And so it was getting my camera stolen in Florence that gave me the ability to call myself a professional photographer and start making money in the wedding industry. Because at the time, if you didn't have a medium format camera, you weren't considered professional and no one would hire you. And so I literally went through the pain of losing all my cameras, and that gave me the gain of becoming professional according to the world. So no pain, no gain. And even getting your cameras stolen can be somewhat valuable.
Fantastic, Jared. It's been an absolute pleasure having you as a guest on the Camera Shake podcast this week. Thank you so much.
Nice to talk to you. Thanks.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for today's episode. It was awesome having Jared on the show. But before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you'll like. Check out episode 187 with Russell Preston Brown. I'm sure you'll love it. If you enjoy this content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake to help us keep bringing you amazing episodes. It really does mean the world to us. And for those of you listening on audio, did you know that there's a video version of this podcast over on YouTube? Well, you should by now because I keep mentioning it all the time. You get to see our guest's stunning photography in full Technicolor. Just head over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you can watch all of our past episodes on there as well. And if you're already there, be sure to drop a comment, hit the like button, ring the bell, and share with your friends. Your engagement helps us reach more people across the globe. So thanks again for listening and watching. And remember, a new episode drops every Thursday, so make sure you mark that in your calendars. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.